people who live in rural areas, what's the most unsettling thing you've ever experienced? I live alone in rural Mississippi, in a house surrounded by cotton fields that stretch for miles. One summer evening, around sunset, I was sitting on my porch when I noticed something odd in the field, about 200 yards from my house. There was a scarecrow standing in the middle of the cotton. That immediately struck me as strange because I hadn't put it there, and the field wasn't even mine. It belonged to my neighbor. I figured maybe he'd put it up recently, and I just hadn't noticed it before. I went inside and didn't think much more about it. The next evening, I was back on my porch when I noticed the scarecrow again. This time, it had moved. It was now about 50 yards closer to my house. I stared at it for a long time, trying to convince myself I was misremembering. But I was sure. It had been much farther away the day before. I walked out into the field to get a closer look. As I approached, I could see it was a crude thing, made from old clothes stuffed with straw, with a burlap sack for a head. The strange part was that the clothes looked relatively new and clean, not weathered like you'd expect. I called my neighbor and asked him about it. He told me he hadn't put up any scarecrow and said he'd check his field the next day. Over the next week, the scarecrow kept moving. Every single day, it was closer to my house. 10 yards closer, then 20, then 50. I started taking photos to document it, because I couldn't believe what I was seeing. By the end of the week, it was standing at the edge of my yard, maybe 30 feet from my porch. I called the police and showed them the photos. They came out to investigate. One of the officers examined the scarecrow and told me someone was clearly moving it. He said it was trespassing on my property and could be considered harassment. He told me to call immediately if it moved again. That night, I watched the scarecrow from my window. Around midnight, I saw a figure emerge from the cotton field and walk toward it. They adjusted the scarecrow, moving it even closer to my house. Then they turned and looked directly at my window. My lights were off. There was no way they should have been able to see me. They stood there for several minutes, just staring. Then they turned around, walked back into the field, and disappeared. I called the police immediately. They came out and searched the area, but they didn't find anyone. The next morning, the scarecrow was on my porch, leaning against my front door. The clothes had been removed and folded neatly beside it. The burlap sack head was placed on top. Inside the sack was a note. It said, "I've been watching you. I know you're alone. I moved the next month." I couldn't stay there, knowing someone had been out in that field, watching my house, moving that thing closer every night. My grandparents owned a small farm in rural Arkansas, and when I was young, I spent most summers there helping out. One summer, when I was about 11, my grandfather told me I was finally old enough to help him check the back 40 acres. I was excited because I'd never been allowed to go that far out on the property before. We set out early in the morning, walking through fields and along fence lines until we reached the far corner of their land. That's when I saw it. There was a house back there. A small, run-down structure that looked like it had been abandoned for decades. I asked my grandfather about it, and he told me it had already been there when they bought the property 30 years earlier. He said they'd just left it alone. When I asked why, he told me not to go near it. When I pressed him, all he said was, "Because we don't go there." And that was the end of the discussion. But I was a curious kid. A few days later, I decided to sneak back there on my own. I told my grandparents I was going to play in the barn. Then I hiked out toward the abandoned house. The closer I got, the more uneasy I felt. The house was small, maybe 2 rooms, and the door was hanging open. I called out to make sure no one was inside. When I didn't get a response, I stepped in. The inside was dark and smelled awful, like rotting meat and mildew. There was old furniture covered in dust, debris scattered across the floor. But what really caught my attention was one wall. It was covered in photographs, hundreds of them, all of people I didn't recognize. The photos were old, yellowed and faded. Most of them looked like they were from the 50s or 60s. What made my skin crawl was that every single face had been scratched out. Someone had gone through and blacked out every face with marker or pen. I was staring at the photos when I heard a sound behind me. I spun around, and there was an old man standing in the doorway. He was thin, almost skeletal, with wild white hair. He was staring at me with the most intense expression I've ever seen. He said, "What are you doing in my house?" I stammered an apology and told him I was just exploring, that I'd leave right away. But he stepped forward and blocked the doorway. He smiled and said, "Do you want to see the rest?" Then he reached for my arm. I ducked under his grasp and ran. I ran as fast as I could, straight back toward my grandparents' house, without looking back once. When I got there, I told them everything. My grandfather's face went pale. He said that house was supposed to be empty, that no one had lived there in decades. He grabbed his shotgun and called the sheriff, and they all went back out there. The old man was gone. The sheriff told us that based on my description, it sounded like someone who had lived in the area decades earlier, someone who had been declared dead years ago. They searched the house and found signs that someone had been living there recently, food wrappers, a sleeping bag. But there was no sign of who it was, and the photos on the wall were gone. Every single one of them. I never went back to that house. My grandparents sold the farm a few years later. I grew up on a ranch in rural Wyoming. When I was about 13, my family started noticing that things were going missing from our property. Small things at first, tools from the barn, a bucket from the porch, a tarp that had been covering some firewood. Then bigger things started disappearing, a generator, a chainsaw, even a saddle. My dad reported it to the police, thinking we had a thief in the area. But without clear evidence, there wasn't much they could do. So we started keeping a closer eye on everything. That's when we noticed the tracks. There were boot prints in the mud near the barn. Prints that didn't belong to any of us. They were large, maybe a size 13, and they showed up regularly, always at night, always near the barn or the equipment shed. We set up a trail camera to try to catch whoever was taking our stuff. What we caught on camera still haunts me. The footage showed a man, but something was wrong with him. He moved in a strange, jerky way, unnatural, like his joints didn't work properly. He'd approach the barn and then just stand there for long stretches of time, completely still, staring at the building. Then suddenly, he'd move again, darting forward and disappearing inside. We could see him on camera carrying our things away into the darkness, but we never saw his face. He always kept it turned away from the camera, like he knew exactly where they were. My dad and the ranch hands started taking shifts at night, armed and ready to confront him. One night, around 2 a.m, my dad saw him in person. The man was standing at the edge of our property, just outside the reach of the floodlights, perfectly still. My dad yelled at him to identify himself. The man didn't respond. He just stood there for about 10 minutes. Then he turned and walked away. But the way he walked was wrong. His legs moved stiffly. His arms didn't swing. My dad said it looked like a puppet being controlled by strings. The thefts continued for another month, and then they suddenly stopped. We never caught the person. We never recovered any of the stolen items. But sometimes, late at night, I still think about that figure standing at the edge of the darkness, moving in that horrible, unnatural way. I live in rural Idaho on a property that borders national forest land. One winter, I was snowed in for almost a week. The roads were completely impassable, and I was totally isolated. On the 3rd day, I started noticing tracks in the snow around my house. They were boot prints, but something about them felt wrong. They circled my house, getting closer each time, and then stopped at my windows, like someone had been standing there, looking inside. I followed the tracks to see where they came from. They led into the forest, but only about 50 yards in. Then they just stopped. There were no tracks leading away, no sign of where the person went. They simply ended in the middle of the snow, like whoever made them had vanished. I went back inside and locked every door and window. That night, I heard tapping on the glass. Someone was tapping on my bedroom window. I looked outside but couldn't see anyone. It was too dark. The tapping continued, moving from window to window around the entire house. Whoever it was, they were circling the place, tapping on each window as they passed. I yelled that I had a gun and that I'd called the police. The tapping stopped. but I could still see a shadow moving past one of the windows. I sat up all night with my shotgun, waiting for them to try to break in. They never did. When the sun came up, I went outside. The tracks were everywhere. Dozens of boot prints circling my house over and over, like someone had been walking around it all night. They led back to the same spot in the forest and stopped. When the roads were finally cleared, I reported it to the sheriff. He told me there had been similar reports from other isolated properties in the area. Someone had been targeting homes that were snowed in, places where people were trapped and vulnerable, and stalking the people inside. They never caught who it was. I live in rural Nebraska on my family's farm. We have a barn that's about 100 yards from the main house. One night, when I was 17, I was up late doing homework. It was around midnight when I heard the barn door slam shut. I looked out the window and saw a light moving around inside the barn. Someone was in there, using a flashlight. I woke my dad up. We grabbed flashlights and his rifle and headed out toward the barn. As we got closer, we could hear someone moving around inside, shuffling sounds, and what sounded like things being picked up and moved. My dad yelled that we were armed and that whoever was inside needed to come out. The sounds stopped. Everything went completely silent. My dad opened the barn door and we shined our lights inside. What we saw made us both freeze. There was a man standing in the corner, facing the wall, completely still. He didn't turn around. He didn't acknowledge us at all. He just stood there. My dad yelled at him to turn around and put his hands up. The man didn't move. We stood there for what felt like forever. Then the man started laughing. It wasn't a normal laugh. It was high-pitched and hysterical, echoing through the barn. Slowly, he turned around. His face was covered in mud, or dirt, we couldn't tell. And he was grinning. A wide, unnatural grin. My dad told him to get on the ground. Instead, the man bolted. He ran straight at us, and we had to jump out of the way. He was fast, unnaturally fast. He sprinted out of the barn and disappeared into the cornfield. My dad fired a warning shot into the air, but the man was already gone. We called the police. They came out with dogs and searched the cornfield, but they never found him. The next morning, we went back to the barn to see what he'd been doing. That's when we noticed something even stranger. He'd been arranging our tools and equipment into patterns. All the tools were laid out in perfect circles and squares, every single one facing the same direction. There were symbols drawn in the dirt on the barn floor, symbols we didn't recognize. The police took photos and said it looked like some kind of ritual, but they had no idea what it meant or who the man was. Over the next few weeks, we occasionally found more symbols drawn in the dirt around the property, always at night, always in places that weren't visible from the house. We installed security cameras and motion lights, but we never caught him on camera. Eventually, the symbols stopped appearing. To this day, we have no idea who that man was or what he was doing in our barn. My wife and I bought a farmhouse in rural Vermont, and when we moved in, the previous owner told us something strange. He said we should never open the root cellar door in the basement. He said it with such seriousness that we didn't question it. We just agreed. The door was old and wooden, with a heavy deadbolt on it, and we kept it locked, just like he'd asked. We lived there for about 6 months without any problems. Then one night, I woke up to the sound of scratching. It was coming from downstairs, rhythmic, persistent. I got out of bed and went to investigate, and as I got closer to the basement, I realized the sound was coming from the root cellar. Someone, or something, was scratching at the door from the inside. I stood there, frozen, listening. Then I heard a voice. It was faint and muffled, coming from behind the door. It said, "Let me out, please, let me out. I'm so cold." I ran back upstairs, woke my wife, and we called the police. While we waited, the scratching grew louder, more frantic. The voice kept pleading to be let out. When the police arrived, we took them down to the basement. The scratching stopped the moment we got there. One of the officers tried the door, but it was still locked from the outside. He asked if we had the key. I said yes, but explained that we'd been told never to open it. The officer said we needed to check, in case someone was trapped inside, so I unlocked the door. He opened it and shined his flashlight into the root cellar. It was empty, just old wooden shelves and dirt walls. No one was there. There was no way for anyone to have gotten in or out. There was only one entrance, and it had been locked the entire time, but the scratching marks were still there. Deep gouges carved into the inside of the door, like someone had been clawing at it desperately. The officer had no explanation. We told him about the voice we'd heard, and he suggested it might have been pipes or the house settling. But we know what we heard. Someone was in that cellar, begging to be let out. We moved out 3 months later. We couldn't live in that house anymore, not knowing what was behind that door or why the previous owner had warned us never to open it. When I was about 14, I was home alone one Saturday afternoon. My parents had gone into town and wouldn't be back for a few hours. I was in the living room watching TV when I heard our dog barking aggressively outside. He was going absolutely crazy, which was unusual because he was normally a very calm dog. I went to the window to see what was wrong, and that's when I saw a man standing at the end of our driveway, just standing there, staring at the house. He was too far away for me to see his face clearly, but I could tell he was wearing dark clothes, and he wasn't moving at all. Our driveway was almost a quarter-mile long, so he was a good distance away. I watched him for maybe 5 minutes, and he didn't move once. I called our dog inside and locked all the doors. Then I called my dad and told him what was happening. He told me to stay inside, keep everything locked, and that he was heading home, but it would take them at least 30 minutes to get there. I kept watching the man from the window. After about 10 minutes, he started walking up our driveway. Slowly, deliberately. I was terrified. I grabbed my dad's shotgun from the gun cabinet and made sure it was loaded. I'd been taught how to use it, but I'd never actually thought I'd need to. The man walked all the way up to our front porch and just stood there. He didn't knock. He didn't call out. He just stood on the porch staring at the door. I stood in the hallway where I could see him through the window next to the door, but he couldn't see me. He stayed there for at least 15 minutes. Then he walked around the side of the house, and I lost sight of him. I panicked. I ran upstairs to my room where I could see the backyard. That's when I saw him trying all the back windows and doors, testing them to see if any were unlocked. One of our basement windows was cracked open for ventilation. He found it. He started to open it wider. I yelled through the window that I had a gun and that the police were coming, which was a lie. I hadn't called them yet. He looked up at me, and I swear I'll never forget his face, completely blank, no expression at all. Then he smiled. He walked back down the driveway and disappeared into the tree line. My parents got home about 10 minutes later, and we called the police. They searched the property but didn't find anyone. They told us there had been several break-ins in the area over the past few months, and the description I gave matched a suspect they were already looking for. They never caught him. For months afterward, I was terrified to be home alone. Every time I heard the dog bark, I'd look out the window, expecting to see that man standing at the end of our driveway.